All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling democratization. And something tells me this isn't your first rodeo with this kind of topic.
You're right. It's one of those things, isn't it? Always relevant, always evolving. We're talking about the balance of power, how societies make decisions, who gets a say, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. And you've brought a whole treasure trove of sources to dig into. We've got definitions, historical deep dives, even some cautionary tales about what happens when things go wrong.
Because let's face it, building a democracy isn't exactly like assembling IKEA furniture, right?
Definitely not. And that's what I found so interesting about this one source. It really challenged that assumption that democratization is just about, like, having elections.
It's way more than just ticking a box, isn't it?
Right. One of the sources, I think it was Dr. Chen, talked about how it requires a society to really shift its values, not just rewrite some laws.
It's a complete transformation, not just a makeover.
Totally. But before we go too far, let's define our terms here. What exactly are we talking about when we say democratization?
At its heart, it's about moving away from authoritarian rule and towards a system where, well, the people have the power. But the key here is system. It's not just about who's calling the shots, it's about creating a framework, the institutions, the rules, those safeguards for rights and freedoms that make it all work.
So it's less about swapping out a king for a president and more about fundamentally changing how those in power are held accountable.
You got it. And your sources highlight this brilliantly. They emphasize that real democratization impacts everything, how power is shared, how citizens participate, how rights are protected. It's a whole package.
Speaking of rights, there was this term political freedom that really jumped out at me. How does that play out in a society transitioning to democracy?
Well, imagine those fundamental freedoms that let people speak their minds, hold their leaders accountable, without fear of ending up in trouble. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, to criticize the government, things we often take for granted, but they're absolutely crucial.
It's easy to forget how delicate those freedoms are, especially for countries just emerging from authoritarian rule. In fact, one of your sources, I think it was a study on emerging democracies, pointed out that a free press functions very differently in a place with no history of independent media compared to, say, the United States, where it's been a cornerstone for centuries.
It's a whole different ballgame, and that's why there's no one-size-fits-all approach to democratization. History, culture, even a country's economics play a role. But some common threads always emerge. Take political participation, for instance. Having rights on paper is one thing, but people need the actual means to exercise them, to engage in the process.
Which brings us to another big one from your research. Universal suffrage. The idea that every voice counts equally. But looking at these sources, it's rarely that simple, huh?
Absolutely not. It's easy to think of universal suffrage as the finish line, but it's an ongoing battle, even in established democracies. Your sources dig into the history of voting rights movements, the tactics used to suppress voters, and the debates surrounding disenfranchisement and how our electoral systems are designed.
A good reminder that building a democracy isn't a one-and-done deal. It requires constant work, vigilance, and adaptation.
You said it. It's a journey, not a destination. And like any good journey, there are multiple paths you can take. It's not always a straight line from A to B.
Oh, tell me about it. Reading these case studies, it's amazing how different the road to democracy can be. You've got these dramatic revolutions, and then others where change is much more, well, gradual.
It's like they say, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Or maybe a less gruesome analogy is in order.
Probably a good call. But you're right, the process can be really different depending on the context.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's driven by those grassroots movements, people power, like that incredible people power revolution in the Philippines you mentioned.
Exactly. But then you look at other cases, like the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's external pressure that triggers these huge shifts towards democracy.
A real domino effect. And then there are those top-down reforms we touched on earlier, the ones where the folks already in charge decide to, well, shake things up.
Right. And one of your sources, I think it was a political science journal, made the point that these top-down transitions tend to work better when there's a genuine desire for positive change, not just a power grab in disguise.
It's all about the motivation, isn't it? Are they truly committed to reform or just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic?
Ouch. Good analogy.
And that same article mentioned another interesting factor, a strong middle class. Apparently that's a pretty good indicator for successful democratization.
Makes sense when you think about it. A more educated and financially secure population is more likely to demand a say in how things are run.
Exactly. They've got more skin in the game, so to speak, and often the resources and the know-how to actually participate in civic life. But here's the kicker. Even when a country seems to have all the ingredients for a thriving democracy, the work is far from over.
It's like building a house.
Yeah.
Right. You can lay the foundation, put up the walls, but if you don't maintain it, if you don't keep an eye out for cracks and leaks, the whole thing could crumble. And that's where things get, I don't know, a little less theoretical and a lot more, well, real.
Right, because we're not just talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about the very real ways in which democracies can break down. And sometimes the consequences are, well, they're pretty dire.
One phrase I kept bumping into in my reading was political decay. It sounds kind of, I don't know, ominous.
Yeah, it's not exactly a cheerful term, is it? It gets at this idea that democracies, well, they're not static. It's not like you reach a certain point and then, boom, you're done. They require upkeep, constant attention, like anything else worth preserving.
It's like that old saying, freedom isn't free.
Exactly. And your sources do a great job of outlining those threats, those factors that can chip away at a democracy's foundation. Corruption's a big one. When self-interest starts to outweigh the common good, that's a recipe for trouble.
It's like termites eating away at the foundation of that house we were talking about earlier.
Perfect analogy. And then there's this erosion of trust when people start to feel like the system is rigged, like it's not working for them anymore. That's incredibly dangerous.
And we can't forget about populism, which several sources highlighted as a major challenge. It's almost like a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, it can be a sign that people are fed up with the status quo, that they want change.
It's a symptom of a deeper dissatisfaction, absolutely. But here's the danger with populism. It often relies on these, well, overly simplistic solutions to incredibly complex problems. And it can easily devolve into this kind of us versus them mentality that undermines the whole idea of democratic debate and compromise.
It's almost like it hacks the system, bypassing those institutions and norms that are supposed to keep a democracy healthy.
And when those safeguards are gone, it creates this void. And often, authoritarian leaders are more than happy to fill that void, promising easy answers and scapegoating entire groups of people for society's problems.
Which leads us to, I think, the most sobering part of our conversation today, the idea of failed states. It's almost unimaginable, isn't it? A complete breakdown of order. A government that can no longer provide even the most basic services to its people.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario, but unfortunately, as your sources point out, it's a reality for millions of people around the world. And when a state fails, it's not just a political crisis, it's a human tragedy of epic proportions.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Democracy is precious, but it's also incredibly fragile.
It's not something we can afford to take for granted, that's for sure. It requires constant vigilance, a willingness to call out injustice, and a commitment to those democratic values that we've been discussing.
It's about recognizing the warning signs, those cracks in the foundation, and taking action before it's too late.
Because ultimately, the future of democracy rests on all of us, not just on institutions or governments.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. What role will you play in shaping the future? Stay curious, stay engaged, and never, ever stop questioning.
Because the pursuit of a more just and equitable world, well, that's a journey worth taking, and it's one we take together.